Todas y todos. El día de hoy estamos en un nuevo seminario de la Escuela Ambiental de la Universidad de Antioquia y el día de hoy tenemos un invitado especial. Vamos a estar hoy durante la transmisión haciendo la presentación en inglés, entonces voy a cambiar de idioma. Thank you everyone for being here. Today we are having a very special guest on our seminar at Universidad de Antioquia. Today we have Dr. Brian Soden, who is a professor of atmospheric science and associate dean of graduate studies at the University of Miami. He specializes in the use of satellite observations to test and improve computer simulations of Earth's climate. And his research focuses on understanding the sensitivity of Earth's climate to increasing greenhouse gases and the response of extreme weather events to this warming. Today, Dr. Brian Soden is going to talk about what is happening with the water cycle and the changing climate. So thanks a lot, Brian, for being here. Today you are talking to mostly students and professors from different areas of engineering and also in earth sciences that we studied here in the region. So we are very happy to have you here in this seminar.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you, everyone. It's really an honor to be able to talk to you all today. So I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Reyes and to AGU for giving me this opportunity. I've never been to Colombia, but I've heard many great things about it, especially Medellin. So I look forward to visiting there and being able to see it in person someday. But in the meantime, it's an honor to be able to give this talk to you. I thought it would be fun actually to try to give a bilingual talk, at least fun for me, anyways. So mi texto es en español, pero hablo inglés porque mi español es muy malo. Y espero que los dos son lo mismo. So we'll see how this goes. So I thought I would start out with a riddle. I hope I translated that right. Adivinanza. A riddle, we say in the US, a riddle is like a puzzle. It's like a question with kind of a trick answer. So the riddle here is, what dries as it gets wetter? And the answer, the answer is a towel. But I think maybe a better answer, and kind of the subject of this talk, would be the Earth's climate. One thing we know about the climate is that as it gets warmer, it gets both wetter and drier at the same time. And that may seem like a paradox, like how can you get these increases in these opposite extremes at the same time? But that's in fact what we see is happening. And if you listen to the news or watch the news, I've just put up, some examples here, recent examples of increasing floods, increasing rain events, more intense rain events, while at the same time that we're seeing these increases in floods, we're also seeing increases in dryness and droughts and aridity happening at the same time. And so, one of the interesting questions is, how does a warming climate generate both of these at the same time? How do you get both opposites responding, both a wetter climate and a drier climate at the same time in response to greenhouse gas increases? So my objective for this talk is to really kind of give a high-level overview of how the water cycle responds to a warming climate, kind of at the very, kind of global scale picture, a big picture view of how the water cycle changes, and what aspects of those change we have the most confidence in. What are we, really certain we're going to see in response to a warming climate, and why do we have confidence in those changes? What is it about the underlying physics of the problem that gives us confidence in those changes? And then what aspects of these changes can we already detect in observations? Are we already seeing changes in the water cycle in the observed record that are due to the burning of fossil fuels and the warming of the climate? So this is a picture of the water cycle, a very encompassing picture. And you can see it's very complicated. There's all sorts of arrows and processes involved here, especially on the terrestrial side of the water cycle. And it's very complicated. I'm a reductionist at heart, so I prefer simple things over complicated things. And so this is my version of the global water cycle. And at least from the atmospheric perspective. So I'm an atmospheric scientist. And from the atmospheric point of view, the water cycle is much simpler than that very complicated picture. It's really just involves three things. One, we have a certain amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. And there's these arrows represent the sources and sink of water vapor into and out of the atmosphere. The source is evaporation from the ocean or the land. And the sink is precipitation that removes water vapor from the atmosphere. And so you can actually explain a lot and understand a lot about how the water cycle responds to warming just from this very simple view of the global water cycle. And I'm really going to focus on those things that are robust. And this is a list of things that we can be really confident. These are changes in the water cycle that we have high confidence in how they will respond to warming. And these are the things that I'm going to try to cover in this talk. One is the role of water vapor in amplifying climate change. The second is kind of what I alluded to earlier, that we see wet regions becoming wetter and dry regions becoming drier in response to a warming climate. The third is maybe a surprising one, is that one of the consequences of changes in the water cycle is that the atmospheric circulation actually slows down as the climate warms. That may be a bit of a surprise. You may think that a warmer climate would give a more active, a stronger circulation, but in fact, what we expect to see, and what in fact we are already seeing, is a slowing of the atmospheric circulation as the climate warms. And then lastly are these increasing in these opposing extremes that we get more droughts and more floods in response to warming climate. So these are four aspects of how the water cycle responds to warming climate that we have a great deal of confidence in. And why do we have confidence in these changes? There's three reasons. One is because the physics that underlie these changes is very simple. And it really all stems from something called the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship, or Clausius-Clapeyron equation, that expresses how the equilibrium vapor pressure of water increases as the temperature increases. And it increases very rapidly, almost exponentially, with increasing temperature. And that fundamental relationship of the amount of water vapor and its dependence on temperature is really fundamental to everything that I'm going to talk here. It is the foundation for all of the changes that I'm going to present. So that's one reason that we have confidence, because the physics that underlie these changes is very simple. And there's also agreement, because the underlying physics is simple. All models agree on these changes. It's not something where one model is different from another model, but all models are consistent in representing these aspects of the change that I'll highlight. And then thirdly, we have observations that can confirm and validate this very simple physical process that underpins these changes. So I've emphasized water vapor and the importance of water vapor in everything that I'm going to talk about. And this graph here shows the changes in the total amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. These are taken from satellite observations. So this is the global average of water vapor and its change over the past 30 years or so. And what you can see here is that there's been a clear increase in the total amount of water vapor in the atmosphere over the past 30 years, maybe 5 or 6% increase over that 30-year period. And it's not a monotonic increase. It's not a very smooth increase. There's a lot of wiggles here, ups and downs. And one thing that's surprising, this has always surprised me, but if you compare these changes in water vapor to now what I've shown in red, the blue is still the observed changes in water vapor, but in red now I've overlain the changes in the global average sea surface temperature, the temperature of the ocean surface And you'll see that these two curves look almost identical, right? And the point here is that water vapor is fundamentally, its changes are being fundamentally driven by changes in temperature. There's a very tight coupling between the two. So when it's warmer, you have more water vapor. When it's colder, you have less water vapor. And that not only explains this long multi-decadal increase that we've seen, but even these year-to-year fluctuations in water vapor, there's a very tight coupling between temperature and water vapor. And again, that tight coupling between temperature and water vapor is the foundation that provides the basis for all of the changes that I'm going to be exploring in the rest of this talk. And of course, because, as I said, that underlying change is so simple, models are very capable at reproducing these changes in water vapor. So now I'm comparing the observations with two sets of climate model simulations. And you see that the climate models are very successful in reproducing these observed changes in water vapor that we've seen over the past 30 years, almost indistinguishable between the two. And so not only are the models in agreement with each other, but they're in very close agreement with the observations in terms of this dependence of water vapor on temperature. So that gives us lots of confidence that we can trust the model projections of changes in the hydrological cycle that stem from this change in water vapor. And again, it's this change in water vapor that is driving everything that I'll be exploring in this talk. So the first topic that I want to look at is how water vapor amplifies the change in climate. And that can be understood very simply just by looking at the climatological distribution of water vapor. So what I've shown here on the left is just the annual climatology of ocean surface temperature. And then on the upper right is the annual climatology of atmospheric water vapor. And you can see, again, that places that are warmer have more water vapor and places that are colder have less water vapor. So again, there's this tight coupling between temperature and water vapor. But water vapor isn't just any gas, it's a very important gas. And in fact, water vapor is the dominant greenhouse gas. It absorbs more infrared energy than any other gas. So that means that where you have more water vapor, you also have a stronger greenhouse effect. And that's what's shown on the bottom right panel. So where you have warmer temperatures, you have more water vapor, you have a stronger greenhouse effect, and that stronger greenhouse effect traps more infrared radiation and further amplifies the temperature. And so you get this loop between temperature, water vapor, and greenhouse effect, and we call this a feedback loop. So this means that water vapor is amplifying, its dependence on temperature is amplifying these spatial gradients in temperature. And just like water vapor amplifies the temperature response spatially, it also amplifies that response in time. So as the climate warms over time, you see more water vapor, and that increase in water vapor further amplifies the warming. And we can understand and illustrate just how important this water vapor feedback is on climate by looking at climate model simulations. So here are a set of climate model simulations where we've increased CO2 at 1% per year. And each line here represents the global average temperature change. And this is the years down on the bottom. And so we can see as you increase CO2, the temperature increases, the climate gets warmer. But as the climate gets warmer, there's also more water vapor going into the atmosphere because a warmer climate contains more water vapor. And you might think that most of this warming is driven directly by the CO2 increase, but that's actually not the case. In fact, most of this warming, only a fraction of the warming that you see here is a direct result of the CO2. Most of the warming that you see here is a result of positive feedbacks in the climate system that are amplifying the initial warming from CO2 and making it even greater. And you can understand just how, in water vapor, of all these feedback processes, water vapor is by far the most important. It is the dominant feedback process. It is the dominant greenhouse gas, and it amplifies the warming here more than CO2 itself. And you can understand that if you can do sort of a hypothetical example. Let's say we took all of these climate models, and instead of allowing the water vapor to increase as the climate got warmer, we held it fixed. So we can remove this water vapor feedback from the climate model. And these are just hypothetical models. This is totally unrealistic. But we can just see, by doing that, we can see exactly how important this water vapor feedback is. And so these hypothetical models are shown in blue here. So in these blue models, we've suppressed any increase in water vapor as the climate warms, and the water vapor is just constant as we increase CO2. And you see that you get much less warming. In fact, you get less than half the amount of warming than in the actual models shown in red. And so the point here is that water vapor is fundamental. It amplifies the changes in climate. It makes the climate a much more dynamic system. And so the presence of this feedback, the fact that water vapor depends on temperature, more than doubles the changes in climate that we get from an increase in CO2. So that is probably the most fundamental role that water vapor has in determining climate change and in amplifying changes in the water cycle. The second aspect of the hydrological cycle changes is that as the climate warms, wet regions become wetter and dry regions become drier. So why is that? So we can go back to this very simple picture of the atmospheric water cycle to help understand this. And so consider this to be the global average picture here. On a global average, the rate of precipitation must balance the rate of evaporation. So these arrows, precipitation and evaporation, are equal. And that applies on the global scale. But on a local or regional scale, that balance doesn't apply. So if instead of looking at a global average, we're just able to look at a local region, let's say in the tropics. In the tropics, we consider that to be a wet region, meaning that the precipitation is greater than the evaporation. And the reason you can have more precipitation than evaporation in the tropics is because the atmosphere is transporting moisture into that region. So there's a moisture import by the atmosphere. It's transporting water vapor into this region. And that additional water vapor allows precipitation in the tropics to be greater than the rate of evaporation. Similarly, if you go to a dry region, like in the subtropics, in a dry region, the rate of evaporation is greater than the rate of precipitation. And that additional moisture that's evaporated into the atmosphere isn't turned into precipitation locally. Instead, it's exported, it's transported out of that region by the atmosphere. So there's a net export of moisture out of that region in the subtropics. Now, what we know is that as the climate warms, the amount of moisture in the atmosphere increases. So if we go back to the tropical region and we look at what happened, as we increase the amount of moisture in the atmosphere, if the circulation doesn't change, then we see an increase in the amount of moisture being transported into that wet region. And as a consequence of more moisture being transported in, that means that the precipitation must increase faster than the rate of evaporation. So this wet region becomes wetter simply because there's more moisture in the atmosphere as the climate warms. Likewise, if you go to the dry region in the subtropics, this region is dry because we're exporting moisture. The atmosphere is exporting moisture out of this region. As you increase the amount of moisture in the atmosphere, that means more moisture is being transported out. And in order to balance that, evaporation must increase faster than precipitation in this region. So that means this dry region becomes drier as the climate warms. And if you look at climate model simulations, of the changes in precipitation, you see this signal very clearly. So the figure on the right shows the zonally average change in precipitation from one particular model at the end of the 21st century under some emission scenario. And what you see is that in blue is where precipitation is increasing. So precipitation increases in the tropics and in the mid to high latitudes. So these wet regions are becoming wetter. And precipitation is decreasing, where it's brown, in these subtropical regions. And the figure on the left shows the climatological distribution of precipitation. And you can see these two curves look very similar to each other, because these wet regions in the tropics are becoming wetter, the dry regions in the subtropics are becoming drier. And again, this fundamental dependence of wet getting wetter, dry getting drier, is simply a reflection of the increase in the amount of moisture in the atmosphere, this process that we have a great deal of confidence in. And you can even see this pattern of change of wet getting wetter, dry getting drier if you look at observations. This is a study that looked at rain gauge measurements over land over a very long period, a 75-year period. And what they found were systematic patterns of wet regions becoming wetter and dry regions becoming drier. And those changes were actually being attributed to the effect of increasing CO2 on the climate. So we're already seeing the effect of anthropogenic climate change in amplifying this contrast between wet and dry regions. And there have been other studies that have looked at satellite observations, which have a shorter record, but they provide global coverage. And those studies also show this pattern of wet getting wetter and dry getting drier as the climate gets warmer. So we see observational evidence that supports that general pattern of increasing contrast between wet and dry regions in response to a warming climate. Now, one of the other things that happens as the water cycle changes is that it also imposes constraints on the atmospheric circulation. And so you can understand this, again, we can go back to this very simple picture of the water cycle. And again, we have the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, we have precipitation, and we have evaporation. As the climate warms, all of these increase. The amount of water vapor increases, the global average precipitation increases, and the global average evaporation increases. But what's important is that they don't increase at the same rate. The amount of water vapor increases roughly at a rate of 7% for every degree warming. And this stems from that Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. It comes right out of that equation. You see that the equilibrium vapor pressure of water for temperatures close to the surface increase at about 7% per degree. So that's a very rapid rate of increase. Precipitation or evaporation, on the other hand, increase more slowly. They only increase at about 2% per degree warming. So you have this disparity between the rate of increase in water vapor and the rate of increase in precipitation. And precipitation or evaporation have to increase more slowly because they're constrained by the energy budget of the atmosphere. So that increases more slowly than the changes in the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, which is determined by thermodynamics and the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. So we can understand how these things are related to each other. We can create a very simple model for precipitation. And that's what is shown here by this equation. We can think of precipitation as being the product of two quantities. One is the vertical mass flux of air due to convection. So that's the amount of air that's being transported vertically by convective updrafts in the atmosphere. And the other is the concentration of water vapor per unit mass of air, or the water vapor mixing ratio, at the lower part of the atmosphere in the boundary layer. Because we know that the concentration of water vapor decreases very rapidly with height. So as you lift parcels of air from the surface up to the top of the troposphere, almost all of the moisture from the surface is going to be rained out. So if we take this simple relationship that precipitation is the convective mass flux times the amount of water vapor, and we look at the fractional changes of that equation, we see that the fractional change in precipitation should then be equal to the sum of the fractional change in convective mass flux plus the fractional change in the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. So we already know, as I said, that water vapor increases at 7% per degree, right? So we can stop there and we can think, maybe the easiest way to understand this is to say, if the circulation didn't change, if the atmospheric circulation didn't change and water vapor increased at 7% per degree, well, then we would expect precipitation to increase at 7% per degree. But as I said, it doesn't, it can't. It's constrained by the energy budget of the atmosphere, and it increases more slowly. It only increases at 2% per degree. So by this simple model of precipitation, this predicts that, well, the only way you can have precipitation increase more slowly than the amount of water vapor is to actually reduce the rate of the convective mass flux. And the convective mass flux is what drives the overturning circulation in the atmosphere. So therefore, the convective mass flux must decrease as the climate warms, at least according to this very simple model. Now we can look and test that simple theory against a much more sophisticated model. This shows an actual climate model simulation, and where we actually measure and look at the change in convective mass flux as the climate warms. And that's what's shown in red here. And we can see that the convective mass flux, the fractional change in this convective mass flux, decreases by almost 20% over the first century of a 1% increase in CO2. And that rate of decrease is very similar to what would be predicted by this very simple theory, that the change in convective mass flux is really just the difference between the fractional change in precipitation and the fractional change in water vapor. That's what's shown in black here. And the two agree very well. And it's not just this model, but any climate model, as the climate warms, its convective mass flux weakens. And that weakening of the convective mass flux drives a weakening of the overturning circulation. So as the climate warms, we expect the circulation to become slower, to become weaker. And one of the interesting things is that when you think of the overturning circulation in the atmosphere, you usually think of the Hadley circulation. That's the dominant mode of overturning in the atmosphere. But models generally don't weaken the Hadley circulation. What we see is that as the climate warms, models tend to weaken not the zonal mean overturning circulation, but they weaken the zonally asymmetric, sort of the longitudinal overturning circulations in the atmosphere. And so what that means is the dominant longitudinal overturning circulation is the Walker circulation in the Pacific. So what models predict is that as the climate warms, the circulation weakens, and it weakens by preferentially weakening the Walker circulation over the Hadley circulation. In fact, the Hadley circulation weakens very little as the climate warms in these model simulations. But one of the paradoxes, if you're familiar with what's been going on in the Pacific over the last couple of decades, is that the Walker circulation has actually strengthened over the last 30 years or so. And that's created a bit of a paradox. How is the Walker circulation strengthening when it should be weakening? And it's an active area of research, and I don't have a complete answer for that. But one thing we do know is that observations do indicate that the overturning circulation of the atmosphere is weakening, that the convective mass flux is weakening at the global scale. That's what's shown here in red. So these are in red, we have observations of the rate of decrease of the convective mass flux. And so the convective mass flux is weakened by about 5% or so over the last 30 years. That's what's shown here in red. These colored lines represent different ensembles of climate model simulations. And there's a little bit of difference here, like in around 2004, 2005, but overall the climate models are in pretty good agreement in terms of the total weakening of the circulation over this period. They also show about a 5% weakening. But what's different is that the climate model simulations are weakening by weakening the Walker cell, whereas the observations are showing that, well, the Walker cell is not actually weakening, but the net circulation, the total overturning circulation, is in fact weakening. And the difference stems from the patterns of surface warming that have, or surface temperature changes that have happened in the Pacific. And so what the yellow lines represent here are a set of climate model simulations where we've actually imposed the observed pattern of temperature change over the last 30 years. So the blue and green simulations have a weaker circulation by weakening the Walker circulation. The set of yellow climate model simulations have a weaker circulation, but they're weakening the mean circulation while the Walker circulation is strengthening. So in a manner that's maybe more consistent with what is actually going on in the real world. And both of these changes are much larger than what you would get from internal variability alone. That's what's shown in the black lines. Those are climate model simulations where there's just internal variability. There's no external forcing. There's no increase in greenhouse gases. So the trend we've seen over the last 30 years is presumably being driven by human activities. But exactly how this weakening is happening is still a bit of a mystery. I think our current working hypothesis on this is, well, the net circulation is weakening, and it's weakening primarily in this longitudinal sense, and that perhaps it's a weakening of the monsoonal circulations that we're seeing here, rather than a weakening of the Walker circulation, because the Walker circulation really hasn't weakened over this period. Okay, the last topic that I'm going to talk about is how we get this amplification of extremes. We see both more intense droughts and more frequent droughts, but also more intense flood and heavy rain events. How do you get this increase in these opposing extremes? And the easiest way to understand this is that the rain that's generated by an individual storm is really, that precipitation is really being driven by moisture that's already present in the atmosphere. So the precipitation intensity, the amount of rain during periods when it's actually raining, really should increase in proportion to the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. So in other words, the intensity of rainfall in storms really should increase closer to this 7% per degree number. But on average, if you average over an entire year and over the entire globe, precipitation has to increase more slowly. So on average, precipitation can only increase at 2% per degree. But when it's raining, when it's actually on those times and in those days when it's actually raining, it can increase much faster than that. But in order to balance out, that means it rains more intense when it's raining. In order to balance out the slower average rain event, you need to have fewer rain events over the course of a year, or you need to have those rain events more spread out. So that means when it rains, the rainfall is more intense, but you get fewer rain events over the course of the year. There's more dry days. And we can see this very clearly if we look at climate model simulations. So the map on the right shows the change in precipitation intensity. That's the intensity of the rain event, the intensity of rainfall when it's actually raining. And you see everywhere basically sees an increase in the intensity of precipitation. However, even though the rainfall can be more intense, many regions see greater gaps, longer dry periods between rain events. And that's what's shown in the panel on the left. So the warm colors, red and orange and yellows, indicate regions where there's an increase in the number of dry days. So there's longer dry spells in between the rain events. And so you get, again, not only wet regions becoming wetter and dry regions becoming drier, but the variance in the water cycle over time is also increasing. You're getting more intense rain but you're getting longer gaps between rain events. And we can see this pattern also in the observations. So this is a figure from the IPCC report, as was the previous figure. And I think this may even be from the chapter that Dr. Arias co-authored. But what it shows are, on the left are all the rain gauge measurements that show positive trends in the maximum daily precipitation. So that's over the course of the year, the maximum precipitation you found out of all 365 days in the year. And you can see that there's far more stations reporting increases in maximum daily precipitation than showing decreases. In fact, for every station that shows a decreasing trend, there's 2 stations that show an increasing trend. And if you look at the number of stations with statistically significant trends, there's 4 stations with an increasing significant trend for every 1 station that has a significant decreasing trend. So what we're seeing overall is this increase in the most intense precipitation events over the course of a year. And this is a very clear signal that's been confirmed in other sets of analyses and observations. But at the same time, we're seeing the most intense rain events increase. We're also seeing longer dry spells between rain events. And you can also see that in the observational record. This is a paper, a recent paper from Wainwright et al. And what they show are changes in the length of the dry spells, so dry spell length, over different regions. So brown indicates longer dry spells, so an increase in the number of days of dry spells, and green shows a decrease. And what you can see are on the top are climate model projections for the 21st century under increasing CO2. And on the bottom are the pattern of changes that we can already see in the observational record. And they have a very similar pattern where regions, especially you notice over Brazil, Mexico, the southern portion of Africa, and regions of Australia and Asia, where there's this increase in dry spell length, despite the fact that many of these regions are seeing more intense rain events. So those are the 4 main aspects that I wanted to highlight. These are changes in the water cycle that we have a great deal of confidence in, and they all stem fundamentally from this increase in water vapor with temperature. So we have a great deal of confidence in them. Models are in very good agreement on these types of changes. But these are changes that are these kind of very large-scale changes. And the most important aspects of the water cycle are the ones that affect us as people, as individuals. They affect societies and ecosystems. And those changes are happening locally. And when you get to understanding and being able to predict local changes in the hydrological cycle, it becomes much more complex. It's much easier to kind of step back and look at these large-scale patterns of change that I've talked about here. They're simple and we have more confidence in them. But the real challenges for the future, I think, are being able to better understand, better observe, and better model the changes that are happening locally. And those are much more complicated changes, and kind of the general rules that I've highlighted here don't always apply at that local scale. And so I just wanted to kind of end with some thoughts on what the future is for this area of research, and where I think a lot of efforts are being focused on now. And certainly one thing that we can do, and one thing that we're doing here at the University of Miami to try to improve our ability to make predictions about how the water cycle will change locally here in Florida or in South Florida, is to improve our ability to model the very fine scale hydrological processes. So that involves developing more sophisticated models, having very much higher horizontal resolution, so we can really resolve a lot of the features that are relevant at the local scale. So that's one activity. That's something we're pursuing here locally at the University of Miami. But another aspect is it's one thing to be able to try to model and simulate these things, but there's huge data gaps, especially over land of quantities like soil moisture. We're really lacking the ability to detect long-term changes in soil moisture. And this is an example of that. This is from a recent paper by Rodell and Uyghur, where they show the global distribution of in situ groundwater measurements. And you can see that there are just, even over land, there are huge gaps in our ability to say what is actually changing over land. But there is good news here as well. There is a satellite that's been flown for over 20 years now called the GRACE system. I forget exactly what GRACE stands for, but I know what it does. It's able to actually measure changes in soil moisture and groundwater by measuring changes in the Earth's gravitational pull. And there's a very nice paper, Rodell et al. 2018, where they highlight just the remarkable ability of these satellite measurements to be able to monitor both kind of transitory changes in soil moisture as well as long-term trends in soil moisture. And you can see they've highlighted a lot of these recent kind of soil moisture anomalies. But it's really impressive to be able to, you compare these two maps of what we can get from in situ measurements versus what we're able to monitor with this new satellite. And this gives us hope that we can, not only evaluate these models, but also better understand the local processes that are driving these changes in soil moisture and drought over these regions. So I'm very optimistic about the future of being able to monitor changes in the water cycle over land with really innovative measurements like this. And with that, I want to thank everyone for their attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Soden. This has been a really, really nice talk.